Support for this video comes from Skillshare, which offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more.
One of the things that makes a project of this scope and scale so complicated and difficult is just the sheer number of balls in the air that need to be managed. That is, the materials, the techniques, the equipment, the procedures that all need to be harnessed and controlled and directed into one final result so that success can be guaranteed. And with every one of those variables, there exists the potential for conflict. That is, something to go wrong and for success to be jeopardized. But if those potential areas of conflict are seen in advance, if they're controlled for, they can be converted into opportunities, even assets. And that's exactly where we are with this project. Now, if we remember, two of my major concerns were structural stability and integrity, and movement. Because this panel is delicate, it has a history of breaking, and I wanted to make sure that that is addressed. Also, this painting is going into a fairly inhospitable final location. So I came up with the solution of adding a honeycomb fiberglass panel to the back of the original wood panel. And that's going to add a lot of structural support and make sure that this original painting, this panel, isn't vulnerable in the future. Now, I also thought that that honeycomb panel would control the movement of the wood, because of course this honeycomb panel is pan flat. It's stable, it's impervious to temperature and humidity change. And so that would stop the wood from moving. Well, I'm glad that there were some lingering thoughts that I had in my head, because I reached out to a bunch of different people to find out how they deal with wood movement. Now, I talked to furniture conservators, and by and large they said, wood movement, it is what it is. It's not really something that we can stop or control for. We're okay with it. I talked to some furniture builders who said, yeah, wood movement's not great, but we control for it. We plan that into our projects. We don't do things where wood movement would be catastrophic. I also talked to a couple of veneer manufacturing companies, and they said, well, we've largely eliminated wood movement. And that caught my attention. So I talked to them some more, and I found out that the way that they deal with wood movement and the way they eliminate it is by using some incredibly strong adhesives. Adhesives that unfortunately are not reversible. And so for painting conservation, they're just not acceptable. Because one of the tenets of all the work that I do is that it must be reversible in the future if ever it needs to be undone. So I started looking at other adhesives that were reversible and started seeing if any of them would be able to stop the wood movement. And unfortunately, I kept on running up against adhesives that just weren't strong enough to prevent this wood from moving. Not to mention, even if I did use a reversible adhesive, in order to reverse it, the adhesive would need to be subject to either heat or solvent. And in between this honeycomb panel and the original wood panel, there'd be no way for a solvent to penetrate. So solvent reversible adhesives wouldn't necessarily work. And this honeycomb panel is an incredibly good insulator. So the heat required to soften heat-activated adhesives would have to be so high that it would really run the risk of doing damage to this painting. So now I have a twofold problem. I can't stop the wood from moving, and I can't even use any of the adhesives that I thought I could use. And my head was swimming. And so I started looking outside of the box and thinking about where disparate materials have to be bonded together in environments where there is constant movement. And it landed me in the home building industry and talking to some contractors, specifically tiling contractors. Because tile is either stone, porcelain, ceramic, terracotta. It's brittle, it's rigid, it doesn't move. And it often gets bonded to a wood-based substrate. It's either real wood, OSB, plywood, engineered wood, and all of those do move. They are flexible. And that difference in flexibility can potentially cause the bond between the tile and the substrate to fail, and the tile could crack or it could pop right off, and the whole project would be a failure. Kind of like what we have here. And so the home building industry has come up with a very novel approach to dealing with this movement, and it's called an uncoupling or decoupling membrane. Uncoupling membrane, decoupling membrane, what is that? Well, simply put, it is a material that goes in between two different materials where they have different rates of movement. And it allows for a little bit of movement in desired directions while resisting movement in other directions. And so I decided I was going to employ that same technique in this painting's conservation. And so what crazy space age futuristic material am I going to be using for my membrane? Felt. Yeah, felt. No, I am not kidding. Wool felt. Now, I'm using wool felt as opposed to an acrylic or a synthetic product because wool is impervious to hydrocarbon chemicals and the solvents that use those chemicals. Unlike acrylics or synthetics, it's not going to melt. It's also impervious to heat. It's not going to melt or compress to a degree where it's unusable when it gets heated up. And on top of that, the felt manufacturers have pretty specific data and research on the properties of how this felt acts. That is, they know the shear strength, they know the peel strength, and that's all really important in deciding which felt is appropriate for this project. And so, how is this uncoupling membrane going to actually work, and how is it going to be a benefit? Well, the felt is going to get permanently bonded to the honeycomb fiberglass panel. That's going to be a bond that will not break. But on the other side, where it gets bonded to the wood panel, I'm going to be using a conservation grade reversible adhesive, one that's heat and solvent reversible. Now, what it's going to allow is for the wood panel to move a little bit, to expand and contract vertically and horizontally, just a little bit. Now, we're not talking inches here, we're talking fractions of a millimeter, but just enough so that any built-up tension that's in the wood will be allowed to dissipate, that it won't be held by the wood and potentially cause the wood to burst, to check, or to pop off of the honeycomb panel. And that's because while the felt will allow a little bit of movement on the x-axis and the y-axis, it will not allow movement on the z-axis. It has an incredibly high peel strength. So this wood panel is going to be able to breathe just a little bit, but it's not going to distort. It's not going to twist or cup or bow or pop off the panel. And another benefit is the reversibility, because this felt will be accessible from all four edges of the painting. A solvent can be injected into this felt, or this felt can just be saturated with that solvent, and that adhesive bond between the felt and the wood panel will become weakened and release. And so what was a potential problem that jeopardized the success of this whole project has now been turned into an opportunity and an asset that is actually going to benefit this project more than if I didn't include it. So, felt, honeycomb panel, wood panel. Let's go make a sandwich.
So everything starts with the felt, and this isn't something that you're going to be able to buy at your local craft store. This is ordered directly from the manufacturer, and it's a really high quality product. This felt is often found in printmaking blankets because of its resistance to deformation and because of its high compressive value. Now this is about 1/8 of an inch thick, but with a really sharp pair of razor edge shears, I can cut it with relative ease. Now I have to heat the adhesive up to make it flow better and to activate it. And I'll put it in a nonstick pan, which actually, believe it or not, this adhesive sticks to nonstick surfaces. That shows you just how good of an adhesive it is. And then I can take a roller and I can apply it to whichever surface I so desire. And in this case, I'm going to apply it to the wood. And I have mixed this adhesive to be a little bit thicker than I normally would use because I want a good thick layer to sit on the surface of this wood panel. Now, I can thin the adhesive down if I want to use it on a canvas and I want it to penetrate through the canvas weave, but in this case, I want it to sit mostly on the surface. I'm not really concerned about it penetrating into the wood pores. I really want the adhesive to be on the surface so that when the panel does get bonded, there's enough adhesive to make a good bond. The next step is to apply that same adhesive to the felt, but in this case, it comes as a film. And so I can cut the film and peel off the nonstick layer, and then I can transfer it over to the felt and I can apply it using an iron. Now again, I need about 150 degrees to make sure that that adhesive bonds to whatever it's touching. And so I'll set my iron and I will start to adhere this film down. Now I'm going to start in the center and work out towards the edges so that I don't get any ripples, much like you would when you're stretching a painting. It's important that I don't get any ripples because those could manifest themselves through whatever I'm mounting to this substrate. Now, in this case, it's a wood panel, so they're probably not going to manifest themselves through the wood panel, but in the case of canvas, that's a possibility. Now, I'm using a little steel weight behind the iron to help cool and keep it flat while it cools. If I don't do this, what ends up happening is ripples and waves will form as the film cools. So this is just a little trick that I've picked up over many, many years of working with this product. And it just saves me a little time and makes sure that the surface is as smooth and flat as possible, which is something that I'm going for. Now with the adhesive applied to both the wood panel and the wool felt, I can assemble those two and transfer them over to the hot table. And I'll bring the hot table up to about 150 degrees, and once it is at temperature, I can turn the heat off, turn the vacuum pump on, allow it to cool, and expel any of the excess air from that Mylar pocket. It's really important that this adhesive reaches 150 degrees Fahrenheit so that it can activate and reach its full adhesion properties. Anything less and it just won't be as strong, and anything more and it will start to break down and it won't be as strong. Now, once it is fully cured and cool, it is an incredibly strong bond, not one that I would be able to break with my hand. Now, generally, when I use the hot table, I try to recycle as much of this film as possible, and this piece of film has been around the block a couple of times, so it's just time to retire it. Atop the painting, I had applied a piece of siliconized Mylar, just so that anything that was on the Mylar film that I just peeled off wouldn't stick to the painting. And below the painting, I also put a release piece of paper just so that the wool wouldn't stick to anything on the table. I just want to make sure that it's clean and there's no impediments to getting a perfect product. And now I can walk over to my table and I can start trimming off the excess felt. I cut a larger piece of felt than I needed so that I had a little bit more wiggle room when I was putting this all together. It's always easier to have more material and trim the excess off than it is to try to align irregular shapes and fluid materials on the first go round. Now, this isn't particularly difficult. I'm just using an incredibly sharp blade and running it across. And I want to remove all this excess felt because I want this to be crisp and clean. I don't want this to be visible, and I don't want it to get in the way of framing or the next steps when I mount this whole thing to the honeycomb panel. So, unfortunately, can't save these little scraps, but they are serving a larger purpose. Now, to bond this fiberglass honeycomb panel to the wood and felt assembly, I'm using that same 2-part epoxy adhesive that I used to create the honeycomb panel. And I'm using this because it has excellent adhesion to fiberglass. It is pretty easy to work with. It is incredibly strong, and once it is cured, it is inert. Now, I don't need this part to be reversible because the inclusion of that felt layer will facilitate the injection of a solvent that will soften up the adhesive that I use to bond the felt to the wood panel. So this part can be completely permanent because if it ever needs to be taken apart, this honeycomb panel will likely be discarded. Now I'm using a 1/8 inch V-notched trowel to spread this adhesive, and that's actually a pretty important step, because if I just used a putty knife or a flat trowel, I would probably get high spots and low spots and an uneven distribution of adhesive, and that could compromise the overall bond once it's cured. But by using a V-notched trowel, I can ensure that the dispersion of this adhesive is even across the entire surface. Now, once I have the adhesive over the entire panel, I can place the wooden felt assembly onto it. And as you'll notice, I can place it in the wrong position. Well, this panel is not quite square, and the honeycomb panel is. So it takes a little bit of finesse to get everything just right. And that's another reason why I like using a slow cure adhesive. If this were a rapid cure adhesive, I might not be able to lift this up and reset it into the proper position. But once I have it where I want it, I'll apply a little bit of hand pressure just to make sure that there is the beginnings of a good bond. This is not what is going to ensure a very strong bond, but I just want to make sure that when I'm moving it, it's not going to slide around or move at all. Now, I can take it over to the hot table, and I can use the vacuum pump to apply even pressure downward on the painting so that we have a really good bond. The vacuum pump is pretty simple in that there are holes in the corners of the table, and the cotton webbing that you see running from those holes around the painting allows the air to be sucked out of this envelope that I'm creating with Mylar and tape. Now you might notice something down there in the right-hand corner. Well, that's not a cat, it's not a Sasquatch, it's my son who was with me during the filming of most of this project. And he makes several cameos that by now I'm sure you are all too familiar with. He's a great helper, by the way. So once everything is where it should be, I can turn the vacuum pump on and I can extract all of the air, and that will ensure that I have good even pressure across this whole panel, and that's going to make sure that the bond is really good. I'm also going to add a little bit of heat just to speed up the curing time, and also a little bit of heat helps the adhesive with its flow. It gets a little less stiff when it's warm. And now with the assembly of the honeycomb, felt, and wood all complete, I can start to remove this facing. And if we remember, this facing is a washi-kozo that was adhered with a fish gelatin. And washi-kozo is a Japanese mulberry paper. And mulberry paper is significantly stronger than tissue paper or even regular wood paper pulp. And it provides the perfect material to face and protect this painting. Removing it starts with some warm water and an application on the surface. And once that warm water is allowed to saturate the paper and penetrate through to the adhesive, it will soften that fish gelatin adhesive. And once softened, it will release its adhesion. And then I can start to peel back these large sheets. Now this is a significantly thicker piece of kozo than I normally use because I wanted an extra layer of protection and some structural integrity when I was handling this painting. Now, because it's so thick, it comes off in large sheets, which is really a benefit to me. It speeds up the process of removal, and it requires less water and less labor on the painting. And, you know, I've said it before, and I will say it again. In fact, I'll say it ad nauseum, that it kind of breaks my heart to have to use this beautiful material, this beautiful paper, in such a destructive way. Now, obviously, it's the perfect material for my needs here, but it's not designed or made for conservation. In fact, washi-kozo, or Japanese mulberry paper, is generally made for creative purposes, calligraphy, screen making, sumi ink painting, or even watercolor painting. And if it breaks your heart too to see me destroy this really beautiful paper, maybe you'd like to try your hand out at creating something with it. And the first step is to head over to Skillshare, the online learning community for creatives, where millions of people come together to take the next step in their creative journey. And if you're at a loss for where to start, I'd like to suggest a class by Kat Cocolette, Watercolor Techniques, Exploring Skills to Create On-Trend Paintings. But maybe watercolor isn't your thing. Maybe it's photography, or animation, or marketing. Whatever it is, Skillshare offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and, more importantly, curious people. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 2-month free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Now, without a doubt, one of my favorite parts of any conservation process is cleaning the paintings, because this is where I finally get to see what lies beneath all of this dirt and grime, old varnish and old retouching. And this has been a long time coming. I mean, we are on episode 4 of 5. Generally, the cleaning happens early on, but because of all the structural issues, I had to delay this process until now. And I'm going to start by using a detergent paste and an enzyme cleaner to remove any of the surface grime. Now, this painting may not be tremendously grimy. It may not have a lot of cigarette smoke or dust and dirt or soot from fireplaces or oil burning furnaces. But removing all of this accumulated surface grime is absolutely essential, because if I don't do that, it's going to be harder for the solvents that I'm going to be using to get access to the varnish layer, and that could potentially lead me to using an overly aggressive solvent. So this 2-part cleaning process is super important. It's also important because if I ever just wanted to take the surface grime off and leave the old varnish, if that's what the client wanted, I can do so using those surface grime removing detergents. But in this case, the client wants everything gone: the grime, the varnish, the old retouching. So I'm going to start off with a very mild solvent mixture. And I start off with a very mild solvent mixture because I want to make sure that I'm not going to use anything that's too aggressive or potentially damaging on this painting. Now, I've made tests along the edges. I always do that as a first step when I am assessing this painting, and that was done way before any work started. And so I have my notes, and I can refer back to the solvent mixtures that I used that were successful in removing the varnish. Now, you can see here the varnish is coming off fairly easily, and with it, some old retouching. Now, this is a case where it appears that the retouching was executed atop an old varnish, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It definitely makes sure that the old retouching can be removed. One of the unfortunate things is that if the retouching was done well, and the old varnish is a natural resin varnish, it's going to darken and discolor, and then by removing it, all of the old retouching will come off. And there are times when the retouching is good enough that I don't have to remove it. But unfortunately, in this case, it's going to come off one way or the other because we are removing the old varnish. And I just smelled it because I just wanted to check to see if the varnish was coming off. And sometimes using all of your senses can be of great benefit. Now, as I move over to the area of white, or what I expect to be white, it's a good barometer to see how much is on the painting and how much needs to come off. Obviously, working in the area of the coat, the black area, or the brown, or the green of the drapes in the background, it's a little harder to determine what the true color is. But here in the collar, we know that it's going to be a white, gray, cool, maybe a little bit warm, but it's definitely not going to be yellow. And sure enough, it's not yellow. It's a beautiful light gray white. But there's a lot of surface grime and varnish on here. This is, again, one of those cases where it appears that the varnish was applied over some old surface grime, maybe even some old varnish. I guess the painting just was never properly cleaned. And so all of that stuff that's stuck in the texture of the paint, in the little valleys of the impasto, all that little brown stuff eventually has to come off. And that may necessitate using a stronger solvent or mechanical means. But for now, I'm using a fairly mild solvent just to lift off this varnish. But you can still see that a lot of the old retouching is coming off, which I have mixed feelings about, because the painting, as you remember from the introduction, didn't look that bad when looking at it from the front. I was mostly concerned about the back and the structural issues that it presented. Well, I may have spoken too soon, because this painting is completely overpainted. I mean, head to toe, tail to tip, Just about every surface of this painting has been glazed in and overpainted. And what I mean by glazed in and overpainted is that at some point, somebody took an oil paint, thinned it out, and started effectively repainting this painting, going over areas and applying thin layers of paint to build up or unify the image. And really, there's only one reason why that may have been done, and that's because the image wasn't whole. And there's only one reason why that would be the case, and that's because somebody was overly aggressive and skinned the painting. And skinning is a term that conservators use to describe when a painting is overly cleaned and the top layer of the paint is removed. It's effectively, the painting is skinned off. And as I'm working on this face, we can start to see some of what I was talking about. You can see dark areas where the overpaint is still adhered to the original paint layer, and some of that dark stuff is actually old adhesive. Now, the good news is that the painting underneath all of this looks really pretty. It's a really bright painting, and we can see the flesh tones start to come out. But as I start to clean this painting, and as I move down throughout the face, and as I reveal more and more of what lies beneath all of this cover-up work, well, it's not surprising. If we consider what the back of the painting looked like, and all of the shoddy, sloppy work that was on the back, it should come as no surprise that the front of the painting suffers the same fate. I was hopeful, perhaps a little bit naive or Pollyannish, that it wouldn't be the case. I'm always hopeful that the best case scenario is going to present itself, but I've been doing this long enough that I'm not terribly surprised when that's not the case. Now, I did examine this painting under blacklight, and oftentimes a blacklight will reveal old retouching, but not always, because if there's a thick enough layer of discolored varnish and the overpaint is old enough, sometimes that black light can't penetrate through the varnish layer, and sometimes that old overpaint doesn't fluoresce as much as new overpaint. And so sometimes you just can't really get a good read on how much overpaint there is. In addition, if the entire painting has effectively been glazed in and there is more areas of overpaint than not, well, you may not have anything to compare it to. And so you may not realize just how bad it is until you realize just how bad it is. Now, ultimately, I'm not scared by this. I've encountered paintings that are much worse. I'm just a little bit bummed or a little bit disappointed. Again, I had high hopes that this painting wasn't going to require a lot of retouching, but it looks like it will. You can see that areas throughout the face have been overly cleaned, scrubbed, abraded, and you can see some of the underground or even the wood starting to show through. Actually, this painting looks like the ground layer was incredibly thin, not very built up, not a lot of ground. So some of the original paint and the ground were completely removed, revealing just the bare wood. Now, again, the one thing here that I can take away that is positive is that the painting, or what's left of the painting, really is quite stunning, and the artist was really talented. There's a beautiful array of colors. The transitions and the volume that was created with the colors is really quite skillful. And that's what makes me excited, that I get to work to get the painting back to that state. It's just kind of a bummer that so much of the original painting is missing. Now I'm going to continue to work slowly throughout this face and take extra caution to use an extra mild solvent, because this is the most important part of the painting, and I don't want to run risk that I remove any of the original paint. And the solvent that I'm using is incredibly mild, and you can see it really takes a lot of effort for me to remove this old varnish because the solvent just isn't cutting through it as fast as a very aggressive solvent would. So close up on the eye, and you can start to see some of the discolored old oil paint. And that's one of the reasons we don't use oil paint when we retouch, because it oxidizes, it cross-links, and over time, it darkens. And so what looked good when it was originally applied, well, now it's too dark and it doesn't look good. And oil paint is difficult to remove. Luckily, in this case, much of it is atop of the varnish, but some of it, probably from a previous conservation attempt, is on the original paint layer itself. And so I'll have to make a determination as to how much of that I can safely remove. Sometimes it's all of it, sometimes it's none of it, and we just have to retouch over the existing oil paint. Now, in addition, there are areas of adhesive from previous repairs that were just left on the surface of the painting. And I can use a scalpel to peel these areas up. I could use solvent, but I don't want to run the risk of doing any damage to the painting. And if this is a water-based adhesive, I don't want to run risk that the wood absorbs any unnecessary moisture and starts to swell. So I can just take my scalpel and I can start to shave it off and remove any of this old adhesive that frankly should have been removed when the previous repair was executed. But again, I'm not really all that surprised that it wasn't. Many of these repairs that this painting suffered were clearly poorly done. And this is just another indicator of that sloppy work. Now, anytime you take a scalpel or a blade to the surface of a painting, you have to be really careful, because the blade is sharp and you don't want to gouge or nick or scrape off any of the original paint. And so that's why I'm using a fairly dull blade here. It's not a brand new blade that is razor or scalpel sharp. It's been dulled down a little bit on a whetstone so that it has just enough sharpness to get underneath this adhesive, but not so much that it's going to slice or scrape off any of the original paint layer. Sometimes even dull tools have a place in your working. So it's important to know which tool to use to get the best result. And so I'll continue to work on cleaning the painting and removing all this old adhesive until I have it down to a state where I feel like it's completely cleaned and it's ready for the retouching. And here's the thing, this painting was really abused during the past interventions. There was a lot of overpainting, and the painting was skinned, and you can see just how bad it is right now. All of those light spots, well, that's bare wood where the original paint was removed during a heavy-handed cleaning attempt. And so it's pretty clear that I have a lot of work ahead of me. And stay tuned, because next time you'll get to see me put this painting back together.